Hey guys, we're back with Refactoring My Christianity with Doug Beaumont. Doug, thank you for being on this podcast. I really appreciate you coming on. Before we jump into everything, do you mind giving a brief introduction on who you are for people that haven't heard of you?
Sure. My name is Doug Beaumont. I am a former professor at a evangelical seminary over in North Carolina. And about 10 years ago, I entered the Catholic Church after 5 years of painstaking research and basically blowing up my entire life. And I'm out in California now. I'm the director of faith formation for a large parish out here. And yeah, that's got a YouTube channel and written a few books and just kind of doing the ministry thing.
Awesome. Well, nice. I came across you on YouTube. You were actually doing a response video on, I think, Tim Gordon, where he was talking about Protestants being Christian. And I really liked your response to all of that because I think in today's day and age, with the tribal nonsense, you see that to the umpteenth degree in all of society. But I think you putting your response out there, showcasing that I feel like somebody coming out saying that Protestants aren't Christians is the same thing if the Protestants say to a Catholic that you're not a Christian as well, and you just lead into this tribal discussion and tribal argumentation. And I really appreciated your response to that.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that was kind of the idea, was that he was trying to kind of give a counter response to what you hear often, which is like, well, I'm not Catholic, I'm Christian. I mean, even a lot of Catholics adopt that terminology, and it can be really frustrating for people that understand what that means. Like, Christian is not a denomination. Christian is a follower of Christ, and to make a distinction between that and Catholic is, extremely rude and ignorant. So if he had just really gone for that angle and it was just kind of a clickbait kind of thing, I would have just, let it slide. I mean, I've done my share of clickbait. That's just the way the world of YouTube operates. But when he really leaned into it and just was trying to prove something that the church has already very clearly spoken on, as if it's even an interesting question at this point, that wasn't something I was cool with. So, yeah.
And I think maybe you can speak on this just because it seems like now with YouTube and everything, you're seeing the slight opening between Catholics and Protestantism as a whole, just because now with YouTube, you have people able to dive in more into the history. There's no a roadblock to better understand the faith because, I mean, back in older times, you just kind of just had to, I guess, read as many books, and they may not be as easily available. But now there's such a wide breadth of information out there to be easily accessible. I mean, you can just grab a book on Kindle for $7 and dive really into a lot of this information. So do you see this the divide between Catholicism and Protestantism slowly closing, and how do you think we could actually bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes both ways. I mean, every virtue has two vices, right? So, when in a time where it's really difficult to get information, it's also harder to disseminate false information, right? So now we end up with, your really good, solid people on YouTube that if people find them, that's great. Very easy access, free. You don't have to go. You don't have to. The barrier to entry that you used to, or like you'd have to be a very committed person to want to go out and learn about a different religion, because it's going to mean going to the library and figuring out which books, and it just, the research level is just very time consuming and difficult and expensive. Of course, the other side is that you have people that, now anybody with a iPhone can sit down and create a YouTube channel, and so the market gets kind of inundated with information, and now it becomes much harder to figure out who you should be listening to. But I do think, the better ones tend to rise to the top fairly quickly. The people that are more dedicated to the truth. I know when I started really researching Catholicism, I mean, I had an entire seminary library at my disposal, so I had a little bit easier time than most people would. But, some of the people that helped me out the most were bloggers, just guys like Devin Rose and Joe Heschmeyer. I'm going to forget somebody really important and feel bad, but it didn't take long to figure out, like, okay, this is a legit website. These are people that know what they're talking about. This isn't just some reactionary And I think that the access, I mean, just like this, you found my channel and 10 minutes later we're talking, that's really great. Like I've been able to have conversations with people that if all they were a published author, I probably never could have got to them, because I would have had to email the publisher or write a letter, for heaven's sake, and mail it. And, it could be a year before I ever got a response. Whereas, when I was looking into the faith and people saw I was taking it seriously, a lot of people are willing to get down and have conversations with you. And that's what I try to do too. I've gotten to the point where I've had to ignore a lot of the comments on YouTube because it's just so much of it's just trolling. And the people that are serious, it's just not a good place, I think, to have a serious conversation. But, I put my email on all of my videos. If somebody really wants to take the time, I figure if you're not so lazy that you can't write an email, I'll talk to you. But I'm not gonna waste hours of my life hitting the same response over and over again from copy and paste trolls. So yeah, it's a weird world, and it's only going to get weirder with AI. We'll see. Hopefully the people that are really doing a good job now will embrace the new technology and remain at the top so that it doesn't get taken over by people that really shouldn't have much of a voice.
Yeah, that's sort of why I was going down this route, because I've sort of come back to the faith and doing it's I want to learn more, and this is somewhat selfish of me starting this podcast, is that I have now the excuse to reach out to people like yourself to then talk to them, and if people watch, great. If not, that I also end up learning. But I think the idea is just evergreen, where people can come and learn more from people that are more experienced than myself, and also talk to people that have conversion stories, because that's always you hit people in different ways. That's one thing I've noticed about already with this podcast, is the different conversion stories of how God speaks to people in different ways. You have somebody that came to the Catholic Church because she liked the traditionalness of it, and you saw women wearing veils, and that really captivated her. And then you have other people that are very philosophical, and they come to it in that way. It's really beautiful to see how people come to the faith. So for you, what was the driver, because you're in this prominent position, but now you're kind of probably having this difficulty of, what was the main driver that brought you to the Catholic faith or Catholic Church?
Oh, I just figured I'd get rich, publishing books. Well, the background is I had received a master's degree in Christian apologetics from my seminary, and they had asked me to stay on. And so I was teaching at the undergraduate level, and we eventually started a doctoral program, which I actually helped build, even though I was also a student. It was a pretty small group of people running this place, and I was still very interested in the same topics. Like I was interested in defending the Bible and defending orthodoxy, and most of the taglines for our school and most of the people that came there, that was what they wanted to do too. They wanted to defend Christianity, what we often refer to as the historic Christian faith. And so that meant, going after cults, and showing why Mormonism is false and these sorts of things. But we also had a pretty standard doctrinal statement that was fairly narrow and really just kind of cherry picked from classical Reformed tradition, but then, we don't like this, so we'll go Baptist on that one. And then, so we just had this weird hodgepodge. And then behind it all, oddly enough, was a devotion to St. Thomas Aquinas. So the person that started our seminary, Norman Geisler, he actually was Jesuit educated. He was in philosophy, and he really fell in love with the writings of Thomas Aquinas. So up to a point, we would go to the good doctor for our arguments for the existence of God and truth and a lot of ethical ideas. But then it would just get cut off once we started talking about salvation and the church and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden now we're reading Dallas Theological Seminary and Baptist stuff. So it was just a bit of a strange place to begin with. So as I entered into the PhD level, I thought, well, this will be a good chance for me to really hit bedrock. Like, I want to go all the way to the very foundational elements of religion and philosophy of religion and this sort of thing, because I don't want there to be anybody that I can't deal with. And so one of the things that I had to look into was we had learned how to defend the Bible as the Word of God, but we hadn't really learned how to defend the canon. So the Bible doesn't really exist. I mean, the Bible is a collection of books, and really every single one of those books needs to be defended if you're going to defend the Bible. And of course, that's a very Protestant apologetic, right? You're defending the book. You're not defending the faith, or at least that ends up being what it reduces to. So I did a whole bunch of work on the canon, not reading Catholics, not reading any Catholic apologists, but I just came to realize that without the Catholic Church being an infallible authority, all we have is a fallible canon. And I didn't like that. I mean, as an apologist and a philosopher, like you can't have a system that's stronger than its base. So that was troubling me. At the same time, I was also looking into the idea of orthodoxy. So, like, even if we can defend the Bible and what books are in it, how do we know that our interpretation is correct? And even if it isn't correct, how do we know who is a cult and who is just a different denomination? Because we also had, you've got this whole idea of essentials, non-essentials. It's very confusing. And again, I realized that if you go back in time far enough, once again, you find the Catholic Church. It's the church that held the ecumenical councils and determined the creeds. And so now I've got the canon, I've got the creeds, I've got the councils, and all of it is just pointing to the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
Holding off on Eastern Orthodoxy for the moment. Yeah, so I mean, over a period of several years, like those convictions really weighed on me that I am not a part of the church that gave me this book that I'm allegedly basing my life on, that my understandings of it are rooted in a church that I am not a part of. And like, when did it become okay to reject that church? It wasn't okay when it put the canon together. It wasn't okay when it held the councils. But then all of a sudden in the, 16th century, it became okay to ignore the church and just read your Bible. And so it was just a matter of consistency for me. Like, I can't act like the Bible and my understanding of it is what it is if I've, completely removed the foundation. And so that was, that's kind of more high theological idealism that got me in. But I would say the move itself was also just motivated by a lot of the chaos that I saw, just the inconsistency, and not that Catholics are consistent, but at least the ideal is consistent, which I didn't even have that as an evangelical. Like this, I can't even justify my own system here.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually I worked through a couple of the little things that, my knee-jerk reactions against Mary and, what are they? I'm trying to think of some of the other things, the papacy, the Crusades, the Inquisition, kind of the standard, like the big five, that everybody has to.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just amazed at, like, really, if I'm going to be a consistent apologist, like, it's actually not very difficult to argue these things. It's certainly no harder than a lot of the things I had to argue as an evangelical. And so eventually just, kind of all the walls came down, and it became a matter of, well, am I going to be consistent or not? And so
Mm-hmm.
that was, in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's back to what I was saying. It's fascinating to see where people are led into the faith in different ways, and you see the one of the things that seems obvious once you now move to the church, and you see the fruits of Protestantism, and you see the sheer swath of denominations that are out there now because they disagree on one point. Oh, let's start a new church, and you just see what the fruits of that are. And it actually leads me to think, because I've seen the rounds of this recently. I don't know if you've seen it. It's been popping up on Reels or on Twitter as well as social media. There's this Protestant pastor that came out. He seems like he was really struggling with evangelicalism, and then coming out and while he was preaching a sermon was saying that the one, evangelicalism is slowly dying, and also the stuff that they've been talking about with the Catholic Church is not true. For instance, that they worship Mary, and he seemed like he was having a real rough. You could just see it visibly when he was talking about it. You could see he's wrestling with these emotions, and I'm sure it's probably difficult because you have these pastors. For him, for instance, he's built his life on becoming that, and I wonder what can we do to bring someone like him into the church in a way that doesn't disorient his life to the umpteenth degree, because you see a lot of conversion stories of pastors in the past where they have to just kind of uproot everything, and now they kind of are back at square one. Do you see any way that we could maybe mitigate that and try to slowly work their way in?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And this is a conversation that I had with several people. And I'm not trying to plug my book, but the first book that I wrote as a Catholic, Evangelical Exodus, was actually a collection of several converts from my seminary. So I had seen people that had converted before me, after me, same time as me, and we had a lot of these kind of conversations. Luckily, most of those guys were just getting started. So, these were students, these were people that, maybe they had a job, but it wasn't like their whole entire life was wrapped up. But for some of us, it was. I had a full time gig. I could have spent the rest of my life working at the seminary and never had to worry about a job again. I was speaking coast to coast. I was getting published. I mean, I had kind of reached the point that I'd wanted to reach. Like, this is why I've been doing all this and suffering for all these years, is to get to this exact point. And the whole thing is just going to get blown up if I walk away. Now, fortunately for me, a lot of my background overlapped with the faith, so that I didn't really have to start over. I wasn't a pastor, because the equivalent of a priest would probably not be open to me as an evangelical, because probably I'm married, and probably I'm not going to be able to just stop my life and do Catholic seminary for years and years,
Mm-hmm.
even if I'm not. So, yeah, that's difficult. At the end of the day, the evangelical is a professional minister in a lot of ways, and you're just going to lose that job. I know the Coming Home Network has been really good about trying to provide support for people converting, but it's not like they have money to give you,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, a lot of it, I think, is, kind of planning your exit strategy. Like, what am I going to do after this? If the equivalent of my position doesn't exist in the Catholic world, then I'm just going to have to do something else. And, I think that if churches are maybe more sensitive to that I don't think most Catholics realize the animosity that exists outside of the Catholic Church in that direction. So to them, it's like, oh, well, you just go do this now,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm losing my friends, I'm losing family. Like, this isn't just go get another job. Like, my entire life network is going to collapse the day I tell everyone I did this. And I don't think there's just any awareness of it. They're completely blown away that, what? Why would anybody even care? Because to them, it's just background noise a lot of times. But yeah, when you're an evangelical and you're serious about it, it consumes your life. I mean, as it should. Um, so, but most Catholics aren't professional Catholics. It's not easy to get paid to be a Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Most Catholics are just Catholic, and then they go live their life, and they've got their jobs or whatever. So, yeah, the idea that becoming a Protestant would completely destroy your life, that's just not even on their radar. They're just completely unaware that even happens. So, I don't know. I think a greater awareness of that would be great. That parishes could maybe provide some kind of support system, like, hey, who understands this? This guy's trying to become Catholic. It's going to ruin his life. Can we
Mm-hmm.
can we try to provide some social network, maybe some job opportunities, just get this poor person
Mm.
through. That would be huge. I mean, that would be an amazing ministry. But now you've got me thinking, like, we need to. Why aren't we doing this?
That's the whole point of this podcast. Get other people, get stuff thinking about
I love it. No,
things.
that's great. Because I do RCIA. Like, I'm the guy. I'm like the
Mm-hmm.
gatekeeper. They come to me and we talk, and so I've kind of been doing that on a personal level. But yeah, that's. I wonder if there just isn't a sense that it's that important, because you don't really see. It's rare in some senses. You don't really have.
But
I'd say probably.
is it rare because there's no network to? They don't see this ability to easily on ramp onto
Hmm.
the Catholic faith. Is that maybe why? Because they see all these stories of people that are converting, but then they hear about the background of, oh, my whole family wasn't really on board with this. It was a whole arduous journey. I lost a lot of friends along the way because it's so extreme with the anti-Catholic sentiment in some areas of the world. And maybe if they have the comfort, a little bit of a comfort, to know that there's some on ramp that will guide them in that way, that will give them some support through it, maybe they're more likely to take that leap.
Yeah, I think that's a very it's a very intriguing question, because there's a part of me that goes, well, Jesus said you're going to lose friends and family, so suck it up.
Hmm.
I did it. But no, I mean, I 100%, I can guarantee that's it, because I talk to a lot of people. I know a lot of people that are heading up to that point where they go out on YouTube and tell everyone that they're Catholic now, um, and yeah, I mean, as much as we'd like to be ideal and spiritual, about the whole
Hmm.
thing, and just say, oh well, God will take care. Shuts the door, opens the window, blah blah. All that. The fact of the matter is that the practical consideration is huge. Like you don't want to go to hell so that you have a friend, but at the same time, it's hard to get past those initial motivations if you've got these anti motivations that are really weighing down on you.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's just, we're human. I mean, like,
Yeah.
we're not just affected by our intellect. So yeah, we need to take those things into consideration.
Yeah, and then people saying that, well, has there ever been a moment in your life where you know that this is the right decision, but it's going to be extremely difficult to make, maybe changing a job at work or something along those lines? And wouldn't it be nice if you had someone to guide you along in that way? It doesn't have to just be in this area. Especially, I would assume for a pastor that's leading a congregation for so long of a time, it's probably they probably feel, I don't know if guilty is the right term, but they may feel some culpability that they went down this route of preaching this, and maybe they had some anti-Catholic sentiment before, and that's maybe entered into their preaching at some point, and now they're thinking, "Oh, darn, now I'm feeling like I made a wrong decision," and maybe they feel some guilt along the way, and they don't want to convert because of that guilty feeling of like, oh, I led these people in this direction, and now maybe I need to stay here to try to lead them in a different direction. I'm not quite sure where that plays out.
Yeah, yeah, because one of two things happen, right? Either you've been wrong all the way up until now,
Hmm.
and you're going to have to admit that and tell everybody. Um, or perhaps you are wrong. You still are not totally firmly convicted. And when does it become okay to tell 1,000 people you should do this other thing? Now that I've been telling you this other stuff for, yeah, I mean, that would be brutal. I mean, that's one thing I escaped. I
Hmm.
really didn't have to do that. My students left every semester, so I was able to extricate myself from the seminary when it was over and it was summer, and I could kind of see the writing on the wall. I didn't know that I'd become Catholic, but I knew I wasn't going to stay evangelical. So by that point, I had a new job, and like, that transition wasn't too bad. But yeah, if I was getting up every day and preparing messages for thousands of people and knew that I had to talk about this, like, that would be brutal. Yeah.
Yeah, I've talked to Keith Nestor on this podcast. I don't know if you've seen him before, but he was a former Protestant pastor, and he probably has good insights on how to help with the transition. And part of me wonders, is it because there's so many of these different uh, uh, places where the different pastors of different denominations are throughout the country, is maybe they could contact the local parish that they're worried about, and like you were saying, maybe in the future there's some program where they're not going to become a priest because that's a long process, but maybe they could uh, get hired on of some frame of doing Bible studies or something along those lines, where they start getting, after of course they go through RCIA process and learning the faith, they can start maybe utilizing those practices. Because I've talked about on this podcast before, there are some things that the Protestant denominations do well, and that is community building. And maybe that is something that a parish could use, and maybe take a pastor that wants to convert and utilize his expertise on how to build the community around that parish and bring people in. Because there's so many times where I look at a parish that's around in my area, and I think, oh, it'd be great if we had a Bible study, it'd be great if we had this type of community. But that, because I'm not knocking the priest, because they have so much on their plate, is that they just don't have the time or the ability to do that. And maybe that's where Protestant pastors can come in if they want to convert, and that can maybe help, and they can start building up a community in that area, and that would be working in tandem together.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, our RCIA team is largely made up of people that either left the faith and came back later in life, or converted. I know you're not supposed to use that word for Protestants, but they haven't come up with a better one. So, um, because yeah, I mean, the intensity with which people enter the faith when they are coming from outside of it tends to change their, it reveals something of their character, and it changes their intensity level. Um, I think there's so many issues. I mean, just off the top of my head, first of all, most parishes struggle to even have the ministries that they have to have. Like, you've got to have sacrament preparation. Well, that means catechist, and that means someone running the catechist, and who's going to pay for all that? And that's difficult enough, much less throwing on another ministry that, again, I think most Catholics don't even realize would even be helpful. Um, when you already having a hard enough time just keeping up with what you have to do, where do you get those people? But yeah, I think that utilizing the strengths that that the Catholic Church lacks because of the way it operates could only make it better if we just put people in the right positions. You don't want to elevate to people too fast. I do think that's one issue, is that a lot of pastors, I think they just go, oh, well, I'll just teach this stuff now, and bam, I can be a great Catholic catechist. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, no, it's going to be a long time before you really get this. There's
Mm-hmm.
a mindset, there's a whole approach to learning and an approach to theology that you don't necessarily have yet. This isn't just becoming Pentecostal from Baptist. So we have to be careful about throwing people into leadership too soon, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's the kind of thing that, like, that example you gave, would be perfect. If your job is to utilize your strength of community building, well, you don't have to be, a cradle Catholic to do well at that.
Yeah, I just see that that's one thing that just seems like it's very lacking in a lot of parishes around, at least in my area. I don't want to speak overgeneralize, but that's at least that's the sentiment I get with even people that I listen to other interviews. That's one of the sentiments I hear. So maybe that's a possibility in a way of on ramping former Protestant pastors that want to convert. And I think hopefully that is the case, and maybe you need to have more people speaking out that have come from that background, like yourself, which I really appreciate. And speaking of your background, you are an apologetic person. You do apologetics, and I just curious, when you are talking to somebody, say from a Protestant background, or they're an atheist, how do you gauge with them on where to take the conversation? Is there like cues that you listen for to know where you should take the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have like a formula, but I think in my mind, I do have something of kind of a hierarchy, I guess, in my mind, that I'm trying to figure out where this person's at. Is this someone who doesn't think that truth can even be known, and just my truth, your truth, very relativistic? Well, bringing a bunch of evidence to somebody like that isn't going to be helpful, because they're just, at the end of the day, they're just going to say, oh, okay, well, that's still your truth. So maybe you have to deal with it at that level. If I've got an atheist that doesn't believe in God, well, then it's pointless to bring in scriptural evidence and things like that, because they're a naturalist. They're gonna see the world through that lens. So we have to deal with that first. So for me, it's really about kind of building on whatever foundation they bring to me. So if you bring me the foundation of strict atheism and Christians are just idiots, it's like, okay, great. We don't have to deal with all the relativism then. So we're already up, we're already climbing the ladder. Now we can actually argue. And so if somebody is a couple steps up, and they not only believe in God, but they're also some kind of Christian, um, then I just look at what I looked at for me is that the foundation of your Christianity is what? Is it your particular church? Like, are you in a cult? Is it just the Bible, and you just don't realize how much influence your upbringing or whatever is skewing your interpretation, so you really just think that the Bible is speaking directly to you, and there's no tradition infecting it? And then there's going to be others that understand, yeah, I absolutely know that tradition is changing the way I see it, but I think Reformed is the best, or whatever. Each one of those requires a bit of a different nuanced response. Um, and I think that, like, overall, with most Protestants, authority is always going to be probably the biggest issue. That just, where are you getting your authority to interpret Scripture? Where do you think Scripture even came from? Can you consistently hold these principles that you even hold if you reject the Catholic Church that kind of gave them to you? And then, there's some people that get that, and they're just, well, there's just this one thing, I can't deal with the Pope. That was C.S. Lewis, right? He was basically Catholic in almost everything he taught, but he had just grown up with such a hatred of the papacy that he couldn't get past that. Well, then that's what we need to talk about. So yeah, it really just depends on what is, at what point are you veering off from the truth? Well, let's try to figure out what that is and get that taken care of, and then we'll see what the next steps are.
Yeah, so how do you broach the authority topic? Because I've said this on this before, but it seems like you have to kind of break down that authority eventually has to. There's an authority structure at some point that comes into determining what the reason or the explanation for, say, a passage in a verse in the Bible, because eventually the authority can be you, your pastor, the hierarchical structure, or it goes all the way up. There is going to be an authority structure determining what the way you understand this passage, because authority is just naturally baked into us as humans on how we determine certain things. So how do you broach that topic and kind of get them to see that, oh, yeah, authority is just naturally a part of how you make a determination?
Well, I think for the Protestant, most of the time, at least I come from a more evangelical side of things than more traditional. More traditional Protestants tend to kind of recognize that there is an authority because they have the Westminster Catechism, they have something, the Book of Common Prayer. So then it's just a matter of just tracing down the source. Like, well, why is the Book of Common Prayer authoritative? Well, because the Church of England. Okay, but why is the Church of England? Well, because, and most Protestants, if they're going to be consistent sola scriptura Protestants, eventually are going to have to say, well, really the authority is the Bible, but this is the best way to understand it. And I think that's one thing that's difficult for a lot of Catholics to get, because most Catholics don't spend a lot of time studying their Bible and actually thinking through it the way Protestants do, because Protestants are trying to figure it out. Catholics feel like they already have it figured out, and so, why even read it sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
More about what you already know. But the Protestant is on a voyage of discovery, right? So when I read the Bible and I go, oh, I've learned something, to me, the Bible taught me that. I'm not seeing myself as an authority. I'm not my own pope. Like, those things don't even make sense because I've just read it. It's right there in the Bible, right? And so you're more what they call kind of a naive realist, someone that just thinks that the words just jump off the paper. There's no interpretive step at all. It's just God speaking right into my brain. For those kind of people, I have to do the opposite, where I have to say, okay, but here are 5 different denominations that all think the same thing you do, and yet all of them are coming to different conclusions. So where are you, like, what is it about what you're doing that makes you able to know you're right and know that they're wrong? And really, Protestantism itself is the best evidence that this is the case, right? Because, I've got an entire shelf of books back here that are just books published of different Protestants arguing with each other about what something means. And it doesn't matter if they're even very good interpretations. It's just the very fact that careful, scholarly people, I don't care how high up, academically, or how low you go, you've got Calvinists all along the spectrum. You've got Arminians all along the spectrum. You've got Charismatics all along the spectrum. Like, don't you see there's this amazing, range of views out there. And so you have to kind of push back. Like, so where is your authority really? How can it be the Bible if the Bible ends up, the effect of doing this process just creates more people disagreeing? And just, I think a lot of people just haven't really thought about it that hard.
Mm-hmm. It's, but to, it's very interesting just because you mentioned the point of just the way they were raised, and that's one of the appreciations that I have with Protestants, because we're, again, when I make the clarification, we're talking about the issues of Protestantism, not Protestants, because so many Protestants that I've been to churches, I respect the fact that they love the Bible so much and they want to learn about it. And that's another thing that I wish, we did more with or Catholics. It wasn't the stereotype of Catholics don't love their Bible. I think that stereotype probably came from a lot of cultural Catholics that just were raised in this and weren't. That was sort of me in my background growing up, is that as a cradle Catholic, we just went to mass. I didn't really understand why. The Bible was some book that I knew that they were preaching from it. They were doing readings from it, which I think that's also sometimes a misconception, that the Catholics don't have any Bible reading
Yeah.
whatsoever. But that's one of the major misconceptions. But it's one of those things that, it has to be ingrained in the culture you're growing up of reading the Bible and trying to understand it. And that's what I respect about Protestants, is that that's part of the raising aspect, is when they raise their kids, they put an emphasis on reading the Bible. And that's what I would love more on the Catholic side. And that's what I want to try to incorporate with my growing family, is showcasing, hey, reading the Bible is good, and and we can find a way of better understanding it through these other sources and how it actually interacts with the mass and everything. And it's one thing that I really respect with Protestants as a whole, is just their love for the Bible and how they have so many different groups and Bible studies. And that's coming back to what I was saying before. That's one thing that I really wish we had more of in different parishes for the Catholic faith. And maybe that's something that will slowly grow over time, because I think you're seeing the shift of Catholics younger Catholics coming back into the faith, being more traditional and wanting to read the Bible and wanting to understand it. And I think you're seeing this resurgence, which is also a good thing too.
Yeah, I've been fortunate that the parishes that I came into the church under in North Carolina and then got hired out here have been very big and very active. And so they can support a lot of ministries, something that maybe wouldn't get 2 or 3 people in a smaller parish, we can get 20 or 30 people just because we're bigger. The ratio may not be any different with enough people. I just did a 4-week series on what the church teaches about the end times. And, we had nearly 200 people show up each night,
Oh,
which
wow.
that's like unbelievably huge for a lot of people. We had John Bergsma from Franciscan University come out here a
Oh,
couple of years
awesome.
ago to teach on the Dead Sea Scrolls of all things. And we had 600 people come out to see this guy. And like he said, I don't get this many people at Franciscan. So my success rate is probably, skewed from what a lot of parishes would be able to pull off, because again, like almost anything we do will work to a certain extent. But one thing I've noticed too is that like even the Bible studies, they get very well attended usually, but they tend to degenerate into book studies.
Mm.
Like nobody really seems to be able to maintain an actual Bible study. They don't even really seem to know what it is. They call it Bible study, but really it's just, oh, we're going to read this book by whoever. And it's like, that's fine, but it's not a Bible study. Like, it's clear, like I don't think you even really know what that is. But that's something that we're kind of trying this year, actually, is like we've started a women's Bible study that is like, I've had a lot of talks with the leader, like we are really actually doing Bible study. And then, I'm going to be trying to start something as well. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Like if we can actually maintain like a real actual Bible study at a Catholic parish. I don't really see any problem with it. I think it's just not the expectation. We're so used to having all these great teachers and all these great writers that it almost maybe seems like a waste of time to just try to do it on our own.
Mm-hmm.
I've got Scott Hahn, I've got all these saints, and I'll never get through even their writings. So to just open up the Bible, which seems terrifying, and just go for it on my own, especially when you see what happens when Protestants do it. I think there's a reason that Catholics shy away from it, but yeah, we need people that are confident that no, this can actually be done and it can be really fruitful. to get people past it. And like you said, I think that's where former Protestants can come in. That like this,
Hmm.
you don't have to be afraid of this.
Yeah, I think one of the conversations I had in the past is that it seems like a guy that transitioned to the Catholic faith was saying that Protestants probably need to be more reserved on what they try, and the Catholics need to be more open to trying new things, and that's one definitely is the case. And you're
Yes.
you're talking about a proper Bible study. So, what is for Catholics out there that don't know, what is a proper way to do a Bible study?
Well, I think the way to do it can vary. I think that the real point is that the object of study is Scripture itself. The thing in front of me that I'm learning is not Scott Hahn. It's not, Bishop Barron. Um, the thing that I am studying is actually the Scripture. It's the Bible open in front of me. And, if I approach it as a group study, if I approach it as like an inductive kind of study, um, even a book study to some extent, as long as all it's doing is helping you learn the Bible better, I think is useful. But it's when we start studying topics that just reference the Bible and then they reference the saints and the catechism and this letter and that letter. That's when it starts to dilute again, and people still don't feel like they're learning what the Bible even is. You can read a million of those books and have no idea what those citations mean. So to me, it's just really a matter of what is the object of study? What are you learning about? And then the method you use, as long as it's, proper to that object, is acceptable.
Gotcha. So, because I think many people, like you were saying, they get worried that if they're doing a Bible study and they feel like this passage is speaking to them, that they are now becoming a Protestant, for instance. But that's not always the case, because there could be verses that speak to you in a certain way, and that's just private to how it affects you. And I think having those discussions in a proper Bible study would be useful to kind of like talk it through and talk it out, and it's definitely something that I think is needed more and more. Um,
Yeah, I think most of the things that Protestants have done with Scripture are fine. I mean, they've come up with some really good methods for understanding Scripture. I think that really what where it tends to kind of dwindle off for Protestants is what I consider one of the final steps of interpretation is basically checking your work. Go back to the church and find out what the authoritative word has been on this passage, or at least make sure that your understanding of this passage doesn't conflict with orthodoxy. That's really all the church argues. I mean, on my YouTube channel, I think my latest video was one on the 7 infallibly interpreted verses, which is kind of hilarious because as a Protestant, you think, oh man, you got an infallible pope and an infallible church. Like, I can't wait to learn what all of these mysteries of the Bible that I've been struggling with as a Protestant mean, and then you find out that they haven't said.
mm-hmm.
It's kind of frustrating. There's really only a few verses that the church has said you have to understand it this way, but even in those cases, it doesn't limit it to that. It's basically just a bunch of things that you can't deny. And as long as you're not denying orthodoxy, you're pretty free. And that's why there still are Catholic biblical scholars. I mean, some of the best out there, really. There's an amazing amount of freedom to understand Scripture and to go more in depth, as long as you're not going against what Christianity teaches. And really, to some extent, Protestants get that too. I mean, in most Protestant, again, more kind of evangelical maybe, but if you read something and you go, you know what, I think I just figured out Jesus isn't God. Well, they're not going to go, oh, okay. There's a line, there's a line that
Yeah.
they won't cross. And I think Catholics just have more lines. We just have more things that the church has determined over 2,000 years. We're not busy trying to make up a new faith every 10 minutes, so we actually have a history of orthodoxy, and we can look back and say, okay, I definitely made a mistake here. I need to correct that. I think as long as that step is included, you're pretty much safe with just about everything else.
I think that's actually a good message for Catholics to hear when they're doing a Bible study, is that there's not that many things that are definitive. You can interpret a lot of the Bible in a way that fits whatever you're going through, and or whatever you think it is, and talk through. And that's always probably giving people more freedom in the ability to read the Bible, because that's probably what maybe they're fearful of. It's like, oh, I may misinterpret this Bible because their understanding of the authority structure. But I think that allows them to have that freedom to get in, dive into the scripture, dive into it, read it, interpret it in the way that maybe it feels like it works for you in that way. And maybe, like you're saying, check your work to see if there's any scholars that have talked about this. And I don't think it's not something to be afraid of to dive, even though it may seem daunting, but feel free to dive in. It's not going to hurt you.
Yeah. Yeah, like just in this end time study we did, I'm a pretty committed preterist when it comes to certain passages, especially the Olivet Discourse. I firmly believe that this is referring to a first century event, but I also realize that the church often cites verses from that passage to talk about our future. So I needed to explain that to everybody, that like there's a way to do this. There's a way to understand these things. Um, and that I'm not crossing the line. I'm not saying that because these things happen in the first century that they can't happen again, that it can't be a double fulfillment. In fact, I think I can prove that there's a very likely chance that it will be. But that takes a lot more work than just reading the passage and saying, well, here's what I think. So yeah, I think a lot of training needs to be involved, and you need experts. You need people that really know what they're doing to help people walk through this. And again, like, how many of those are there? I think one of the ironies of the Catholic Church is that when it gets to the best, I think our best are better than most Protestants. But when it comes to the average, it's the other way around, right? So any average, decent evangelical church is probably going to have several really good teachers in it, that really know the faith and understand how things work and can explain it and be teachers. And none of them are Scott Hahn.
Mm-hmm.
Scott Hahn, can't lead a Bible study at every parish.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get to the parish and you realize, well, who here could pull this off? You're lucky to find one. And again, that's just because that's just our Catholic culture, right? Like we focus on different things. Most Catholics aren't going to put in the years of effort that it would take to get to that level, because there's just not really any perceived need for it. So yeah, it's an interesting, you leave a certain set of problems behind and you just get another one. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I would encourage Catholics that are listening to this to really dive into. It's been, I feel like the faith is such a treasure with just all the scholars out there, and there's been so many times where my mind is blown with the typology of different stuff in the Old Testament to the New Testament and how it interacts with the Eucharist and the sacrifice that and prefiguring the sacrifice on the cross. It is mind blowing sometimes when you really dive into that stuff, and I feel like it just only enhances the faith even more when you understand the connections of the Bible and how it connects with the Mass and all the different typology. It's just it's amazing, and that's one thing that I would love for people to take from our conversation here is dive into it. It's so rich. It's nothing to be scared of, and it'll only grow your faith more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it brings us back to what we started talking about at the beginning too, that um, these resources are available. Like, Scott Hahn may not be able to come to your parish, but you can get his work. It's not that hard to buy a book or watch a video. If you get like Formed has been unbelievable. I mean, you can spend the rest of your life just going through the Formed website and never run out of material.
Mm-hmm.
Solid. This is Augustine Institute. This isn't just a bunch of whack people, making videos and throwing them up on a YouTube channel like ours, right? This is totally vetted stuff and scholars, and there's just really no excuse to not take advantage of what the church has to offer, because again, I think when you look at the best, if we're judging, Catholics versus Protestants on our best people, I think the Catholic Church is like the clear winner. But again, you have to go out and find that. But now there's just not a lot of good excuses to not do that. If you have a phone or you have access to the internet, like, you can learn all this stuff. It's out there, and most of it is either extremely inexpensive or free.
Yeah, and I think Formed, that's one thing I've started to get into. That site is really amazing with the work that's on there, and that could be something that different parishes utilize as you meet up each week and you just watch a video in a different series, and that would be plenty of information that people could glean from and grow from. I think I don't want to take up too much more of your time because we're getting closer to a hard cutoff point. So there's so much more that I wanted to dive into with you, but maybe
Yeah,
that's
we're
for
gonna do this again sometime.
yeah, definitely we'll bring you back on because there's so much to discuss, especially with the culture and the world these days. But I like to end it off now on the podcast of asking the question of the guest of what have you partaken in that really has increased your spiritual life as a whole, on a whole.
Like since becoming Catholic.
Yeah. So, what practices do you partake in that really it doesn't have to be specifically a Catholic thing, or it just be is something that really improves your connection with God.
Mm. Well, we're allowed a holy hour at work, which is really nice because we have 24-hour adoration, so we can just
Oh,
head
that's
over to
awesome.
the Blessed Sacrament anytime we want to. Um, and I've kind of taken up Aquinas's practice where he would actually study before the Blessed Sacrament, and some of the stories that come from that are like unreal, amazing. So Aquinas is still my guy. Like I'm still just infatuated with his teachings. So. Um, I've tried to kind of follow in those footsteps. That my holy hour is really spending time in the chapel and usually with a book open, that where I can just be like, Jesus, help me understand what I'm reading, and give me insight. And I found that like forcing myself to stop for that hour, I don't have music playing, I'm not surrounded by all this cool stuff, but it's quiet, and the presence of Christ is real there, and it's real in a more localized way. And yeah, it just really serves to give me like a very special time of study, and not just sitting here with a coffee and piles of books around me, which is also great. I think it's more of a devotional practice. I've really enjoyed that.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think that it ties with the world today of how we just have so many screens and it's hard to shut off from the world, but having that time is a really uh, probably a very intimate moment with you and Christ, and that's definitely a practice I want to take part in because I probably should do that more often too, and just go to adoration, and it probably helped me understand all the books that I end up reading because sometimes I look at a book that's very hard to read, and I'm like, I got nothing from this page.
Yeah, that's something that I really appreciate about the church is just that there's just this wealth of opportunities, and you don't have to fit into a certain um, mold. For some people, adoration, I mean, they whip out that prayer book and that's all they're going to do for the hour. Other people are just, on their face on the floor, which, that's just not my style. But it's like, yeah, I can have a holy hour where I'm reading, and that's completely fine.
Hmm.
We don't, just because something is good doesn't mean that we have to do it the way, somebody else is. So, you know, look into what the church offers and don't be afraid just because of the way it's gone down with other people.
Great. That's a great message to end it off. Thanks, Doug, for being on this podcast. Appreciate
All
it.
right. Yeah. Good to see you.
Hey guys, thank you for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview. I always enjoyed all the interviews that I do. If you are new to this channel or this podcast, please subscribe to the podcast or the YouTube channel, whichever way you are watching it. If you are on podcast platforms, listen up. Listen. I would like you to subscribe, obviously, and then leave the podcast a 5-star review, whether you are on Spotify or whether you are on Apple Podcasts. That helps the podcast grow. And as always, just share this podcast with your friends and family. Also, share this YouTube video if you just want to share the YouTube video as well. If you're here on YouTube, that is the best way we can grow this community as a whole. And go to adambuckingham.locals.com if you want to join the community and also support the podcast. So hopefully we can do bigger and better things and have bigger and better interviews, and I can interact with all of you all on a one-to-one basis. So go do that, and until next time, I hope you have a blessed week. Bye.